Thank you, Mike. This is my fourth time, and I'm still waiting for the butterflies to not wake up with me. I have to let you know, I told you before, I think it was the first time I was up here, this is very hard. I'm only doing this because Mike he knows guys, he knows people, so he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. I've learned more about the scriptures in the last 4 months than I did when I first stole a Gideon's Bible from a motel room at the Abbey Resort in Wisconsin. I've been forced to get in here and try to put together a sharing of a message that has taught me a lot, and I hope that at the end of this you have learned a little bit that you didn't know before that'll help you to understand the value of the Old Testament. Today's message is a bridge between the previous 4 books of the Bible, where the Israelites came out of Egypt and spent almost 40 years. I think it was 40 years in the wilderness, and it's going to bridge the last 40 years, the last 4 books of the Bible, with the next 7 books of the Bible. So, what Joshua, the book of Joshua does, it does that pretty well. So if I can put that across today, I'll be very, very happy. Getting to the script, I'm going to be going off script. I'm a Joe Biden guy, so exactly. You go again, I walk off. So anyway, in this study of the book of Joshua, we get to know Joshua. We get to know the book as well. And Joshua has shared in all the events since the Exodus, where he held the place of a military commander under Moses' leadership. We'll also get a tour of the Promised Land. We'll follow Israel's conquest of Canaan, after which Joshua divided the land among the 12 tribes. Now here's a quick overview, real quick. There are 24 chapters and 658 verses in the book of Joshua, and they're all about conquering and remembering. I'm not going to mention the remembering part. I want you to read it and find it. After every conquest, after every specific journey they did, or conquest especially, they marked the place with stones, with a pile of stones, and they didn't call it an altar. It was just a pile of stones. And the message from Joshua to his followers was, we're doing this in remembrance of what happened here, so that in the future you bring your children back here and you tell them what happened here. Okay, but it's about there's another teaching on just conquering and remembering, and it wasn't long enough. I need about 30 minutes today, and the other one was like 12, 15 minutes. So anyway, the key verse right off the bat here in the first chapter says, God says to Joshua, says, "Be strong and courageous, do not be afraid or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." This command is given, to Joshua, like I said in chapter 1, but in verses 6, 7, and 9. Exactly, just about exactly. And this commandment, and just before they begin their plan to enter the land, I think that God wants to make sure that Joshua understands that he is to be strong and courageous and know that God is with him. Okay, so let's look at the book of Joshua just a little bit and back up to the beginning of the tribe of Israel. Let's recall how this story has progressed so far. Well, first, God chose Abraham several hundred years ago. Then his family became the people of Israel, who were then enslaved in Egypt. So then through Moses, God rescued Israel out of Egypt. God made a commandment with them at Mount Sinai. He brought them through the wilderness, all 40 years of it. A little note here, by the way. Most of you should know this. All the adults that came out of Egypt and into the wilderness perished during those 40 years.
Yes.
All the adults that came out perished, except for Joshua and Caleb. Only the children that came out of Egypt and those born in the wilderness will be entering the promised land. So they had a very young crowd coming in. Moses didn't make it, any others. So anybody over 40 to 50 years old, there was none. You know, there were children that were, 10, 12 years old. I don't know what the cutoff was for God to say you're an adult and you're not. Could have been 20 years. I read somewhere anybody over 20 years perished. But anyhow, Israel then camped outside the promised land in the wilderness, and Moses called them to obey God's commands so that they could show all other nations what God is like. Now this happened back in Deuteronomy. But the book of Joshua picks up right after Moses has died, and now Israel is ready to enter the promised land. So the story of Joshua is designed with 4 movements. In chapters 1 through 5, Joshua leads Israel into the promised land. In chapters 6 through 12, they meet all this hostility from the Canaanites. I wonder why. And so they engage them in battles. In chapter 13 through 22, after their victories, Joshua divides up the promised land as the inheritance for the 12 tribes. In chapters 23 and 24, the book concludes with these final speeches that Joshua gives to the people. They're very similar to the speeches that Moses gave to the Israelites at the end of Deuteronomy before he went up the mountain to go to sleep, so to speak. So now let's go to the book of Joshua and we'll see how it all flows together. The first section begins with Moses' death and Joshua is appointed as Israel's new leader. The book's author intentionally presents Joshua as a new Moses. Like Moses, Joshua calls the people to obey the commandments that they were given at Mount Sinai. Then Joshua sends spies into the land just as Moses did back in Numbers, back in chapters 13 and 14. Except it goes a lot better this time. In fact, some Canaanites even turn and follow the God of Israel. Now Rahab, you all know who Rahab is, I presume. She's the one who helped the 2 spies when the Canaanite soldiers were chasing them. They hid, and she hid them on her rooftop and covered them with wheat stalks or wheat flax. And here's what the study of, I went in to study more about Rahab. You just assume a prostitute helped and, she was saved, and I didn't know enough about her. So I wound up in some of you know this term, in a proverbial rabbit hole, just following it, and I found this little golden nugget of information which I identify with a lot. Up until 1991, I was one of those many sinners, a wretched sinner that the Bible talks about. Didn't know God. I knew that there was a God. I never said there wasn't. I was not an atheist. I just was. I didn't want anything to do with Scripture or the Bible. But in 1991, I turned my life around, and by around 1995, 96, that's when I stole the Bible, because in the book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which I'm a member of, I came through there. There's in one of the, I think chapter 5, how it works, somewhere in there it says about God, may you find him now. And so I asked my sponsor, well, how do I find him? And he says, Joe, he's not lost. And so also in there we have this, at the end of a meeting, we have a Serenity Prayer. Most of you know it. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I said to my sponsor, well, how do you get wisdom? He says, I don't know, I ain't got it. And he was having a rough time at home with his wife, although he'd been sober for 10 years. And so at about the same time, I get invited to a church by some guys that went to church. Because I asked them, what do you do on Sunday? And they say, we go to church on Sunday, wise guy, you want to go? I said, sure. So we wound up at Willow Creek Community Church up in the suburbs of Chicago, and I attended there for a while, and in the meantime, Alcoholics Anonymous has an annual retreat or conference up at the Abbey Resort in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and I always would go. And one night I remembered I was going to church. I didn't have a Bible, so lo and behold, you open a drawer in most hotels at the time, or motels, and Wayne knows this story. There was a Bible in there, and I took it out and I opened it to, like everybody does, somewhere in the middle, and yeah, so what? But I took it. I figured that's what it's here for. And Wayne was good enough to tell me, yep, that's what it's there for. And so that was my Bible for several years. I ran into it, and it's a King James. So I ran into a Bible teacher on TV that I really identified with. He's still one of my favorite human beings. And he was a King James only guy. I didn't know there were other editions. But since, when you don't know any better, you go with what you got. And so for many years, even when I got here, I was a King James, although I did switch to a New King James later when I began to teach Bible studies at my previous church. And they weren't like this. No mics. There was a few guys around the table. So I switched to a New King James, and that's a long story. By now, like many of you, some of you anyway, I have probably 5 or 6, maybe 7 different versions of the Bible. People say to get clarification or a different meaning, and I don't think that's right. It either means what it says, and it says what it means. But I have them in case some of you, when I'm out here in our Tuesday group, we have different editions, and we get to read from different editions, sometimes the same verse in a different edition. And it really helps us. I think we do. I think we're having fun in there. But anyhow, I ran into this little story. That was a long explanation of my little story. But the reason I identified with her, when I read this story, and then I showed it to my wife, and she said, you've got to put that in there. Okay, so it's going to take us a little longer today, but I want to stop early enough to have a little Q&A. We haven't had that before. I don't know how to time oh, there's a clock way over there. All right. I was going to look at mine. So anyway, here's Rahab's story from a storyteller, I believe. For most of her young life, Rahab had been a prostitute. This is a woman who engaged in sexual intercourse for money. This is not to rationalize her immoral lifestyle. A person not knowing God may engage in the wrong behavior for survival, not necessarily because they enjoy it. Her life illustrates the genuine faith has. I have to learn how to read. Her life illustrates that genuine faith has instantaneous good works, even from an outsider who has very little knowledge. It moves the person in an opposite direction of what their life would have dictated just a short time earlier. This is the faith of Rahab that moved her to stand for God, utterly renouncing her former way of life. Rahab had heard of the Israelites and their God, so she had some basic knowledge that gave her genuine faith. The book of Hebrews says, by faith Rahab did not perish along with those who were disobedient, after she had welcomed the spies in peace. Also, we have an account of Rahab telling the Israelite spies what she had heard. So let's see what Rahab would say.
I know that
Turn it on.
I know that Jehovah has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how Jehovah dried up the water of the Sea of Reeds before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, the Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For Jehovah your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath.
Thank you, Joyce. I didn't think I would sound very much like Rahab.
And she does.
And she does.
Yes. Okay.
Not saying anything. It just sounds like
She had a North Dakota accent.
North Dakota accent. You bet. So Rahab took that little bit of knowledge of the true God and came to realize Jehovah was deserving of her worship over the Canaanite gods she had known all her life. What she said showed her faith, but her actions of helping the Israelite spies evidenced her faith. So her faith was not a dormant, desolate faith. Does James here, the book of James, come to light? Faith without works is dead. She would have never been declared righteous by God if all she had was some fake, fruitless faith. Her faith moved her to help the spies instead of allowing them to be killed. She put her life in jeopardy for God, a God she had not known her entire life. We folks, we have the entire Bible. We have the entire Bible to show us over and over again how faith is acquired by the Christian. It doesn't happen instantaneously. To some of us, we have faith enough to take that leap. But my goodness, she had rumors, probably from her travelers that stayed at her inn. By the way, an old Hebrew word that was translated to harlot was innkeeper. And because many of the travelers through the land were one night, it would say the one night, it became a one-night keeper or the one-nighter, little inn or hostel or, Motel 6. And I think, and over the years, I believe it happened in the Hebrew because it's now in the Hebrew that it's a harlot, a prostitute. But in my heart, I want to think she was an innkeeper. And so anyway, I don't know where I'm at. Oh yes, we have the entire Bible. So God further used this woman because she would later marry the Judean Israelite Salmon and make her Jesus Christ ancestress many years later through Boaz, Jesse, David, Understand? God does not choose the rich and mighty, know-it-alls, pure at heart. He already has them. He chooses people that are going to appreciate the difference in the lifestyle like I do today. It's a different world, so that's why God does what He does. We can question it sometimes, but it's fruitless. And by the way, that, where am I at? Rahab the king, okay. So anyhow, okay, now the spies left their camp and head for the walled city. Here is the backstory to this message. When the spies got into the city, they went to the home of the prostitute whose name was Rahab. Reading from the Bible here. The town king somehow caught wind that the spies had come into town and were at Rahab's home, and he sent soldiers to have them killed. Rahab knew that the king wanted to kill the spies, and so she decided to hide them on the roof of her home under stalks of flax or wheat. The king's officials arrived at the house, but Rahab told them that the spies had already left and that they had gone in a certain direction. Later, Rahab tells them to go north into the hills and hide for 3 days, and then they'd be safe to go back to Joshua. When the king's officials had left, Rahab asked favor of these spies.
Now then, please swear to me by Jehovah that as I have dwelt kindly with you, You also will deal kindly with my father's house and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our souls from death."
Thank you, Joyce. And the men said to her, I have this in quotes, "Our souls for yours, even unto our own death. If you do not tell of this business of ours, and it shall come about then when Jehovah gives us this land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you." The spies told Rahab that they would indeed save her life if she tied a red scarlet cord out of her window. The scarlet cord was the same cord that Rahab used to let the spies out of her window and out of the city. Rahab could have just told the spies to get out of her house and never let them in. But because she feared God and believed in the God of the spies, she took the risk of letting the men stay in her home. Rahab's belief in God was authenticated in that she received the messengers and sent them out another way. It would be a direct result of the action of Rahab saving the spies that would help in the giving Joshua the victory over Jericho. In other words, if the spies had not returned with information, Joshua might have taken a different tack. Today, Rahab is much admired for her faith and for the real actions that resulted from it. A faith that prompted her to accept the true God of the Israelite spies and to send them away in peace. This faith made her abandon her former life in a moment and then became part of the Israelite people. When we admire her faith, we are not admiring her former life as a prostitute or giving consent to it. We are admiring that which moved her to abandon that life so swiftly and turn to a righteous life. This is a beautiful, beautiful example of the power of true faith. Rahab is to be commended for the faith that transformed her, saving her and her family as well as the spies. That's what I found about Rahab, and I wanted to share that with you because it affected my heart tremendously. I identify with it a lot. I hope there's one or two of you in here that know what I'm talking about. So based on the information, I'm back to my story now. This happened yesterday. I was still tweaking this morning, So based on the information from the two spies, Joshua then leads all the Israelites across the Jordan River and into the Promised Land. Just like the sea parted for Moses on the Exodus, so does the River Jordan part for Joshua. Black water. The priests carry the Ark of the Covenant across a dry riverbed, leading all Israelites with them. Now in chapter 5, the story transitions, so the people look back to their roots as God's covenant people. But then Joshua has this crazy encounter with a mysterious warrior who, it turns out, is the angelic commander of God's army. And Joshua asks him, "Are you for us or are you for our enemies?" And the warrior responds, "Neither." It seems clear that this whole story is not about Israel versus the Canaanites. Rather, this is God's battle, and Israel is going to play the role of spectators or sometimes supporters in God's plan. Which leads to the next section. We find stories about all these conflicts that Israel had with different Canaanite groups, and the first part tells the story of two battles in detail. The first two battles they had are in detail. The others are real boring. I started to read them and I said, yeah, they're real boring, so let's see what happens. But this is the lesson part of Joshua, lesson number 2. Okay, and that's the two battles, and that's followed by a series of short stories that condenses years of battles into a few brief summaries. And then I see another lesson coming later here. The first two battles are against Jericho and then the city of Ai. It is Ai, A-I. The meaning of Ai means the ruin or in ruin. That's about 10 cents worth of stuff. And they offer these contrasting portraits of God's faithfulness versus Israel's failure. At Jericho, Israel is to take a completely passive approach. They let God's presence in the ark lead them around the city for 6 days. And just like Rahab turned to God of Israel, maybe the people of Jericho would do the same. In other words, join God, join Israel in the belief of their Lord and Savior. But they don't. They decide to fight. So for 6 days, the Israelites march around the walled city once and then go home, silently, never uttering a word. By the 6th day, the Canaanite soldiers manning the walls are laughing so hard they can hardly stand. And on the 7th day, the Israelite army marches around the walled city 7 times. Then the priests are instructed to blow the trumpets, and all the Israelite soldiers to begin to shout shouts of victory, not just shouts. There were shouts of victory. You know, it is done. I like that. And so loud that the walls came tumbling down, leading Israel to victory. The point of the story is that God is the one who will deliver his people. Israel simply needs to trust and wait. Now, the next story of the battle at Ai, meaning the ruin, as I said, makes the opposite point. There's an Israelite soldier named Ahan, or the English, the way it's pronounced is Achan, but in the Hebrew it's Ahan. And he steals some of the devoted goods from Jericho. During the war of Jericho, this gentleman steals jewels and things and money and clothing and maybe a cow, I don't know. But he steals some stuff that was devoted to, these were goods that were devoted to belong to God alone. They weren't to go to any human being. They were to be destroyed and buried and whatever. But then he lies about it. So it's a pretty lame move after all that God had done for Israel so far. So Israel goes into battle with the city Ai, and they are totally defeated. And it's only after humble repentance by Achan, or Ahan, and being severely punished for his sin that Israel gains victory. Why do you think they did to this gentleman? Anybody? Yeah, him and his family were stoned in a pile of stones, and that pile of stones was left there as another remembrance. Yes. Okay, this is what happens to you when you approach the tabernacle unholy. See, the land of Israel is not going to be, in my estimation, this is just Joe talk, is going to be similar or likened to the tabernacle. Yes. No sinful people in the land. Yep. That was the instruction given. Later we'll talk about it, how they were to destroy everybody, which they didn't, but that was the thing. And I keep forgetting where I'm at. Okay, so Israel goes into battle, and it's after a humble strength. So they put this guy to death. And what's the point? Do you have the point up there? So the point. And so together, these two stories are placed right up front to make an important point, which I just made. If Israel is going to inherit the land, they have to be obedient and trust in God's commands.
Amen.
They don't get special treatment.
No.
Now, the second part of this section begins with the Gibeonites, who are a Canaanite people group. And they just did the same thing that Rahab did. They turn to follow the God of Israel, and they make peace with Israel. That is a mistake that is going to come back to hurt the Israelites in the future. This is in contrast to all the other Canaanite kings who start to form alliances and coalitions, and they want to destroy Israel. 5 kings of the large cities come together and form a great army. So Israel engages them in battle, and Israel wins by a landslide. This whole section concludes with a summary list of all the victories won by Moses and then by Joshua. So, I don't know, what's it, 6, 12, 16? I don't know if that's all of them or not. That's what I found on my teachings. Now, let's stop for a second, because odds are that these stories and the violence in them, they're going to hurt or bother some of you. If you read Deuteronomy, you know what I'm talking about. Moses gives them instructions on what to do when they get to the land, and then Joshua. We're going to read about that. So, and if you're a follower of Jesus, you're bound to wonder. Number one, didn't Jesus say to love your enemies? Why is God declaring a war here?
Yeah.
First, why the Canaanites? I can go back right now and spend about 30 seconds on this. Canaan, the person Canaan was a grandson of Noah. Noah's son was the son that had approached his father's room or tent while he was passed out drunk and naked, and the Bible doesn't get too explicit, but it leaves you for you to know what happened. And so in those days, Noah cursed his son's son. In other words, Noah cursed his grandson, Canaan. You didn't want to curse your son because your firstborn was a sort of a representation of you. You know, if you have a bad kid, it reflected on you, but if your grandson down the road is... And that's so Canaan was cursed. And Canaan, the person, is cursed. He is the one that establishes the land of Canaan, and everything there is not holy. And that's why it had to go. I'm sorry. I've been talking a lot last couple of days. So the main reasons are actually given earlier, like I said, in the biblical stories. And the truth is that the culture of the Canaanites had become extremely and morally corrupt, especially when it came to sex. And we can check that out in Leviticus chapter 18. They also practiced child sacrifice a lot. And you can read that in Deuteronomy chapter 12. And so God didn't want these practices to influence Israel. And you can see that in Deuteronomy 12:29, I believe. The Canaanites just had to go, which raises the second question. Did God actually command the destruction of all the Canaanites like a genocide? So at first glance, you look at the phrases used in the stories, both in Deuteronomy and in Joshua. Phrases like, they totally destroyed them. They left no survivors or anything that breathes. But when you look a second time more closely, you'll see that these phrases are clearly hyperbole. I had to spell it differently so I would pronounce it differently. I wanted to say hyperbole. These are clearly I should have just gone to the thesaurus and put another word in it. Hyperbole. And they were hyperbole and not literal. You know, so go back to the original command about the Canaanites in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Israel first is told to drive out the Canaanites. Drive them out. It says, I will drive them away out in front of you, as in an exile. Okay? But then, oh, wait a minute. To drive them, okay. But then to totally destroy them. And that's followed by commands to not intermarry them and do not go into business with them. So the thing is, so you can't marry someone you've totally destroyed. Again, it seems like hyperbole. I think you might get the point. But throughout, we use it, I use it all the time, you know. If I told you once, I told you a million times. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. You know, that's an example, a bad one, but. So anyway, the same idea applies to the stories in Joshua, and if you look closely, for example, we're told in Joshua chapter 10 that Israel left no survivors in the cities of Hebron and Debir. But then later in chapter 15, we see these towns, and they're still populated by Canaanites. And so what we're seeing is that Joshua fits with the other ancient battle accounts by using non-literal hyperbolic language as part of the narrative style. And so the word genocide doesn't actually fit what we see here, especially in light of the stories about the Canaanites who did turn to God of Israel, like Rahab and the Gibeonites. And the last thing to think about is these stories mark a unique moment in Israel's history. This is not today. Okay, this is not today. These battles were limited to the handful of people groups living in the land of Canaan. With all other nations, Israel was commanded by God to pursue peace. You can go read Deuteronomy chapter 20. To this day, Israel will not go out of their borders, to make war unless they're attacked. Unless they're attacked. We know the history of the past, 50, 70 years. They have their borders, they've fenced them up and all that, but they've been out of their country only a few times. But even in the last couple of years, they've been attacked from Gaza and from up north near Lebanon with rockets just flying into Israel all the time. And they shoot back, but they rarely leave their country to do battle. Why? Because the world is looking, the whole world is looking at Israel. They're waiting for just a little miscue on their part for the world to say, go ahead and nuke them or something. It's what the world wants. The flesh does not want the existence of Israel today.
Yes.
And I keep forgetting my spot. I should start using my finger. So anyway, the purpose of these battle stories was never to tell you, the reader, to commit violence in God's name. I just mentioned that. Rather, they show God bringing his justice on human evil at a unique moment in history and how he delivered Israel from being totally destroyed by the Canaanites. Now, let's go back to the book's design. Are we up here somewhere? After years of battles, we see an aging Joshua. He starts dividing up the land for the 12 tribes of Israel. And most of the section is like, try reading it when he starts dividing the land. It's just a list of boundaries. It's like looking at a map with no route numbers and no pictures. And so we decided to do this. You can find this anywhere on the internet, the divisions. There's books of them. You can just Google the 12 tribes or anything. You can come up and you can see their land, where they were at. Right here you have Judah is the green. Simeon is right here. I think I can't see it. This is, I believe, Benjamin and Dan. You notice the large parts of land given to certain tribes? Why do you think? Anybody? I think they were the dearest tribes to God, to the Lord. I believe that. Judah, for one, Benjamin, and then you have Manasseh. That's the tribe, that's the sons of Joseph. And then you've got some little ones. Although Benjamin gets a very little bit, but look what he gets. Jericho and Jerusalem. And on and on. Reuben, who was the one that says, okay, let's not kill him. Let's just put him in the well, so to speak. But these three tribes asked to be put on that side of the river because at that time it was plush. It was lush with greenery and just milk and honey. And so they asked to be placed on the east side of the Jordan. Okay, that's called the Transjordan. I think I left that out. I used to have a map with that, Transjordan. And so I just, when I saw the size of land, also probably a lot of them have more desert and so forth, but anyhow. Where am I at? Oh, it's boring. But for the Israelites, okay, it's boring to us to read all these boundaries and so forth. But for the Israelites, these lists were super important. I mean, this was a fulfillment of God's ancient promises to Abraham, that his descendants would inherit the promised land. And this is the first sign of it right here. And so now it was all coming to pass, right down to the last detail, which leads to the final section. Joshua gives two speeches to the people that are very similar to the final speeches of Moses back in Deuteronomy. Joshua reminds them of God's generosity, of how he brought them into the land and rescued them from the Canaanites. He calls them to turn away from the Canaanite gods and to be faithful to the covenant they made. If they do it, it will lead to a good life and blessings in the land. But if they are unfaithful, Israel will call down on itself the same divine judgment that the Canaanites experienced. They will be kicked off the land and into exile. That happened, right? And so Joshua leaves Israel with a choice. He doesn't leave Israel. He leaves the Israelites with a choice. What is Israel going to do? Well, we'll see more in the next lesson, which is the book of Judges. And by the way, I opened the book of Judges, and the title of the next section is something to do with the conquest. I don't believe they're done with the conquest of Canaan. That's what I understand so far, but I haven't read it. And that's what the book of Joshua has taught me these last few days. I really pray that you have learned something about this book that you didn't know before today. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank Joyce again. I'm just reading this stuff. That's what makes it understandable. If I was just reading, I think you'd be falling asleep. Do we have time? No, it's 9:45. Okay. I was trying to make it longer because Mike Lamb told me that he read it over in 23 minutes. It scared me. Okay, thank you very much.
He didn't keep losing his place.
Pardon me? No, he didn't. He wasn't going through all these machinations up here. Thank you. I want about 100 more of you.
Amen.